thank you all for coming to my lecture recital. I would like to especially thank Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Hicks for being here tonight and working on this lecture recital with me from beginning to end. I would also like to thank Dr. Vinitsky and Dr. Sanchez for their guidance and expertise, as well as the staff of the School of Arts. What you just heard was Granados' Danza No. 2, Oriental, a piece that reflects how composers in the Romantic era often utilized stylistic elements of other cultures. While Granados was Spanish, this piece's title and melodic character evoke an Orientalized theme, one that showcases European musical trends while remaining deeply rooted in Granados' Spanish heritage. In this lecture recital, I want to explore how Granados' style world was shaped by a fusion of influences, both musical and artistic, and how he in turn created a voice that was uniquely his own. Granados is a fascinating yet underappreciated composer, one whose music deserves greater recognition. Born in 1867 in Lleida, Spain, he was not only inspired by Romantic composers of the 19th century, but also by Spanish folk music and visual art. His most well-known work, the Guayesca Suite, which was later adapted into an opera, was directly inspired by the paintings of Francisco Goya, demonstrating how deeply interconnected his music was with the artistic movements of the time. Tragically, his life was cut short in 1916 when his ship was sunk by a U-boat while returning from the U.S. after the opera's premiere at the Metropolitan Opera. In the pieces you just heard, you might have noticed certain expressive qualities, lyrical phrasing, rich harmonic textures, and evocative colors. Over the course of this recital, I want to trace the genealogy of influences that shape Granados' musical language. You're going to hear a number of things, connections not only between composers, but also between pianists. Granados wasn't just influenced by the music of Schubert, Chopin, and Debussy as a composer himself. He was also deeply engaged with their works as a performer. While he could not have heard Schubert or Chopin play, he studied and interpreted their music, internalizing their qualities. He even wrote a treatise on pedaling, emphasizing the expressive potential of the piano, an idea that links him to Chopin's own pianistic innovations. Some accounts suggest that Granados performed Schubert's works, explaining the lyrical and song-like qualities in his music. To better understand Granados' musical world, we will first explore one of his foundational influences, Franz Schubert. Schubert's lyricism and harmonic language shaped the expressive qualities that Granados embraces. The two impromptus that you will hear next, number 1 in C minor and number 3 in G flat major, exemplify Schubert's gift for lyricism and harmonic fluidity. As you listen, consider how these expressive qualities resurface later in Granados' works, transformed through his unique Spanish perspective. provides a kind of long, song-like phrases and harmonic fluidity that are so simple to romantic piano music. His ability to sustain lyrical lines through carefully voiced melodies and rich harmonies was something that deeply influenced later composers, including Granados. You may have heard in these pieces how Schubert treats the piano almost like a singer, shaping phrases with great expressivity. This quality is something we will hear again in Granados' music, though with a distinctly Spanish character. In Schubert's first impromptu, we heard a syncopated rhythm in the opening that is carried throughout, and I'll demonstrate. This is something that Granados may have adapted to his unique Spanish style in his music. The third impromptu is all about the different layers of voicing, like those in Granados' Oriental Danza. One of the composers most associated with musical expression and deep emotional nuance is Frédéric Chopin. His Nocturne in E minor, which I will play next, embodies many of the qualities that make his music so influential, such as the long, sweeping melodic lines, subtle harmonic shifts, and most importantly, the use of rubato, the flexible shaping of time that allows for an intensely personal and expressive performance. Chopin's melodic writing is closely connected to the bel canto tradition of Italian opera, such as in composers like Bellini's works, who emphasize lyrical, ornamented melodies and graceful phrasing. Chopin's long melodic lines mirror the expressive vocal lines heard in bel canto arias. Chopin's use of bel canto set precedent for composers like Granados. His deep connection to operatic style likely influenced Granados' decision to transform his Goyesca suite into a full-length opera. As you listen, notice how the vocal quality creates a sense of intimate storytelling, which was central to Chopin's musical language. Granados, we begin to move into a more nationalistic space, where composers sought to capture the essence of their homeland's music. While Schubert was not necessarily writing Austrian music in a nationalistic sense, Granados actively looked to express the rhythms, dances, and colors of Spain. One reason for this difference is that in the early 19th century, German and Austrian composers occupied what was considered the center of the musical world. For Schubert, composing in the Germanic tradition was simply composing music. There was no need to assert a national identity through stylistic markers. Nationalism in music, however, tends to emerge most strongly at the periphery, where composers felt the need to show that their traditions are equally worthy of artistic expression. Granados, like Chopin before him, was working from a position outside the established musical capitals of Vienna and Paris, and his music reflects a deliberate assertion of Spanish identity. By incorporating folk dances, rhythms, and harmonic colors, he wasn't just drawing inspiration from his homeland. He was making the case that Spain's musical heritage was as rich and expressive as that of Germany, France, or Italy. It's not just expressivism that Granados shares with Chopin. They also both express nationalistic interest. Chopin's nocturnes are deeply intimate, yet they also carry a sense of nostalgia and longing, perhaps reflecting his own exile from Poland. After leaving his homeland in 1830 amid political unrest, Chopin settled in Paris, never to return to Poland. Though he became part of the city's vibrant artistic circle, his music remained deeply tied to his Polish identity. He often turned to the dances of his homeland, such as the Mazurka and the Polonaise, not just as stylistic choices, but as a means of preserving a lost world. For Chopin, evoking Polish country life for French audiences was both an artistic expression and personal act of remembrance. This same emotional depth and expressive writing would later shape the way Granados approached his own lyrical writing. Granados' Songs No. 2, Oriental, which I played at the beginning of this recital, follows a structure similar to Chopin's nocturnes. It has a lyrical, expressive melody that floats over a harmonically rich accompaniment. However, the title Oriental suggests another layer. The romantic air is a tendency to evoke the East through stylized musical gestures. While many European composers approach this Orient as something distant and unfamiliar, Granados' Spanish heritage complicates this notion. Spain, with its deep Moorish influence, had its own historical ties to the East. In fact, much of what we now think of as Spanish music, architecture, and culture was shaped by centuries of Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Al-Andalus, now modernly known as the region Andalusia, was actually built by Arabic-speaking Muslim rulers in the Islamic Caliphate that controlled much of Spain for nearly 800 years. This complex cultural history makes Spain's relationship with Orientalism distinct from that of France or Germany, as composers like Granados were not only depicting an exoticized other, but also drawing from a deep part of their own heritage. As a result, the Oriental Danza is not just a reflection of an exoticized other, it is a product of Spain's own musical and cultural past. Through this piece, we see how Granados blends these various influences, much like Chopin did, one drawing from his Spanish roots, the other from his Polish identity, yet both speaking through the same romantic musical language. As we continue exploring the musical dialogue between Granados and the composers who inspired him, we now turn to a Mazurka, a dance form that holds a special place in both Chopin and Granados' output. Originating in Poland, the Mazurka is characterized by its triple meter and distinctive rhythmic accents, especially on the second or third beat. Chopin elevated this dance into a personal form of expression, blending national identity with lyricism and romanticism. Granados, in turn, adopted the Mazurka form but infused it with its own Spanish style. Just as Chopin used the Mazurka to evoke his Polish heritage while living in exile, Granados reinterpreted it by reflecting his fascination with dance rhythms. As you listen to these two Mazurkas, first Chopin's Mazurka in C minor, followed by Granados' Mazurka in B flat minor, consider how both composers used the shared dance form to express a deep sense of cultural identity while pushing the expressive and harmonic possibilities in unique ways. mazurkas together, we can trace the connection between the two. Chopin's Mazurka has a melancholic character and an intimate expression of longing, perhaps reflecting his homesickness for home. Its subtle rubato and dramatic inflections create an atmosphere of nostalgia, a quality that also resonates in Granados' music. Granados' Mazurka, on the other hand, takes the rhythmic framework of the Polish dance but infuses it with Spanish flavor. You may have noticed the more passionate, almost improvisatory character in his treatment of the form, common in Granados' music. At the end of Granados' Mazurka, you heard this long melody without an accompaniment. This is called a recitative, common in the bel canto operatic style that Chopin also draws from in his melodies, as I mentioned earlier. Both pieces highlight how composers of the Romantic era engaged with folk dances not simply as cultural curiosities, but as vehicles for personal and national expression. This brings us to one of Granados' most beloved works, Danza number 5, Andaluza, which is part of his Danza Española, a set that reflects traditional Spanish dance styles. Like his Mazurka, it reflects a blending of folk influence with classical sophistication. However, Andaluza moves us even further into the heart of Spain, evoking the passionate rhythms and rich sounds of Andalusian music. Andalusia, a region in southern Spain, has a rich cultural identity shaped by centuries of Christian, Islamic, Jewish, and Romani influences. This fusion of cultures is especially evident in his music, where Polish scales and Spanish dances intertwine to create an evocative sound world. In Andalusian music, the flamenco style is commonly expressed, embodying the region's rich cultural heritage. Flamenco has 3 key elements: cante, song, toque, guitar playing, and baile, dance. Within a flamenco, there is a deep and emotional singing style known as cante hondo, which means deep song. It encompasses universal themes like love, loss, and death, delivered through ornamented and melismatic melodies. This resonates through the lyrical lines of Andaluza. Listen for the echoes of flamenco and the guitar-like accompaniment, and the expressive singing melody, which is a reminder that for Granados, dance is not just a form, but a powerful means of expressing the soul of Spain. Granados' Danza No. 5 Andaluza, is a striking example of how he infused Spanish folk traditions into a sophisticated classical framework. The expressive, melodic lines, combined with a guitar-like accompaniment, evoke the passion and intensity of traditional Spanish chants. After the publication of Andaluza, it has been transcribed for classical guitar and is now one of the most performed Spanish classical guitar pieces. The influence of Spain, and particularly Andalusia, extend far beyond its borders, captivating composers throughout Europe. One of the most famous examples of this fascination is Debussy's La Puerta del Vino, which I will play next. While Debussy was French, he was deeply inspired by Spanish music, often incorporating its rhythms, harmonies, and imagery into his works. La Puerta del Vino is part of his second book of Preludes and was inspired by a postcard of the Alhambra, a wine cave in the Andalusian region of Spain. This postcard was supposedly sent to Debussy from Manuel de Falla, a prevalent Spanish composer at the time. Although Debussy only spent a couple of hours in Spain, he was captivated by the culture. The piece elicits the rich cultural blends of Andalusia, with its echoes of Moorish history and flamenco traditions. Like Granados' Andaluza, this piece exhibits similar syncopated rhythms to imitate guitar. The syncopated rhythms in La Puerta del Vino are habanera rhythms, with origins in Cuba that became closely associated with Spanish music. Habanera rhythm has dual pulse that you would likely heard in dances like the tango. Both Andaluza and La Puerta del Vino showcase how composers use music to evoke place and culture. While Granados was writing from within Spain, expressing his own heritage, Debussy was an outsider engaging in a form of musical exoticism by reinterpreting Spanish elements through the lens of French impressionism. As you listen to La Puerta del Vino, notice how Debussy uses the habanera rhythm, much like the syncopated rhythm in Andaluza, but filters it through his own harmonic language, creating a dreamlike, atmospheric vision of Spain rather than a direct representation of its music. Both Granados and Debussy, in their own ways, engaged with the idea of Spanish identity in music, one from within, the other from afar. However, the Romantic era's fascination with the other was not limited to Spain. Composers throughout the 19th century frequently looked beyond their own borders for inspiration, often constructing musical depictions of foreign cultures that reflected their own imaginations rather than direct experience. Orientalist music and art were often shaped by colonial attitudes, where European artists depicted the East, whether the Middle East, North Africa, or Asia, through an idealized and sometimes distorted view. The depictions were not necessarily accurate representations of these cultures, but rather projections of European fantasies, reinforcing ideas of the East as mysterious or sensual. In music, this often meant modal melodies, distinctive rhythmic patterns, or bold harmonic colors that evoked an imagined rather than authentic sense of place.